The topic of commercial driver's licenses has been in the news a lot lately, and not for good reason. We've had some really terrible accidents happen, caused by questionably licensed drivers. There was one in Florida that killed a family of three, and another in California that also killed three people and injured four others. These high profile incidents have caused both states and also the federal government to start digging into who is getting these licenses and how. Now, even though we've had a real focus on this in 2025, much of the current situation dates back to a regulatory change that took effect in 2022. And that change allowed CDL training schools to self certify that they are turning out qualified drivers. There is a real safety problem on American roads, and unfortunately, the trucks that our supply chains count on are part of the problem. According to a recent FreightWaves article, there are approximately 100,000 truck crashes annually, resulting in about 5,000 fatalities. Now, those numbers are big, but the problem is that they're growing. Those numbers show a 40% increase in deaths in just about 10 years. And where we are today, the odds of being killed by a commercial truck are 20 times greater than they are dying in an airline crash. Now, before we can solve this problem, we have to figure out what's causing it. And so, in this episode of Art of Supply, I'll start off by talking about that 2022 regulatory change, looking at the minimum federal requirements for safe commercial drivers and the system that was supposedly put in place to ensure training schools follow them. I'll give you the current status of the debate over English language proficiency, as well as the status of non-domiciled drivers. And then we'll turn back to a question that has come up in past episodes and is core to this one. Is there really a driver shortage? Because all of the decisions around all of these different topics hinge on the answer to that question. Now, if you've been following these headlines about CDLs, you've probably heard the phrase CDL mills used a lot. A CDL mill basically pumps out licensed drivers as fast as it can. But as it was put more eloquently in an article on FreightWaves, it refers to operations that exploit regulatory loopholes to rapidly process would-be drivers through minimal training before sending them to obtain their licenses. These organizations, these CDL mills, were the unintentional byproduct of a new federal entry-level driver training regulation known as ELDT. That was the one that was finalized in 2016 and that took effect in 2022. That change allowed self-certification for CDL trainers. Although it was meant to cut red tape, again, to address a presumed driver shortage, it led to the creation of 32,000 registered providers offering some level of training in exchange for a CDL. Now, although we're talking about this as a regulation or a regulatory change, it would be better described as deregulation because it's a significant change from how this process was managed traditionally. In the past, candidates would attend one of about 2,000 state licensed CDL schools that provide comprehensive training programs. Now, however, we have drivers receiving minimal training from one of those 32,000 self-registered training providers that are listed in a federal registry but have very little oversight. More reputable schools provide drivers with about 160 hours of comprehensive training, while self-certified providers may offer a few hours of orientation before sending those drivers to obtain their licenses. Some CDL training schools even claim they can get you a license in 24 hours. And they often include watching YouTube videos in their training protocols. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't standards that have to be met. It just suggests that trainers are not all meeting them in the same way, and that there's not enough oversight or enforcement. Applicants seeking a CDL are supposed to be able to demonstrate proficiency in the rules of the road and also behind the wheel skills. But there is no required minimum number of hours behind the wheel, leading, unfortunately, to the YouTube training approach. These rules apply in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and all U.S. territories. Now, critics of the 2022 ELDT rule think that it was watered down from what had originally been proposed. So, originally, there was a recognition or an assumption that there's a driver shortage, and they're saying, okay, how can we qualify more drivers? But originally, it did include some sort of on the road training requirement. Now, the interesting thing is, even if we agree that the rule is watered down, not all states are equally enforcing all of the terms included in even the rule that we got. States like California, Florida, and Colorado are starting to take steps to put their own legislation in place that would shut down these perhaps unlicensed or improperly licensed facilities and starting to raise awareness about the problem. Now, although opponents of the rule are largely focused on road training, one of the other issues that comes up in all of these articles is the English proficiency requirement and enforcement of federal standards that apply to it. Federal regulations have long required that commercial drivers have to be able to read and speak the English language. They have to be able to speak with the general public and law enforcement. They need to be able to understand highway traffic signs and signals. And that's not just standard ones like low clearance or stop. It's those digital signs that change. They need to be able to understand them. They also have to be able to understand official inquiries and respond and make entries on the reports and records that trucking companies have to keep. Now, in 2016, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration issued a new guidance that even if you are a driver in violation of these rules, you don't have to be placed out of service. And the Trump administration has more recently eliminated that guidance. Now, when we think about the two really high-profile CDL crashes that have taken place this year, English language proficiency is an issue. Florida Attorney General James Uthmire said that Harjinder Singh, who was the driver in the August 18th crash that took place in Florida, failed the written portion of the CDL 10 times before he managed to pass it. He had correct responses to only 2 of 12 verbal questions that were part of that English language proficiency assessment. And he only identified 1 out of 4 highway traffic signs during an interview with the Motor Carrier Administration after he had been taken into custody. So why are the rules so lax about deciding who has the right to get behind the wheel of these massive vehicles? This is where we arrive at the question of whether or not there's a driver shortage. If there is a driver shortage big enough to threaten the movement of freight and therefore jeopardize the health of the economy, then it would seem to recommend lowering the standards to pull in more drivers. Now, not everyone agrees about the idea of a shortage, and not everybody talks about the idea of a shortage in the same way. This issue is incredibly important because the recent accidents that we've seen suggest that the standards may need to be raised, not lowered. In fact, it was industry lobbying that initially contributed to the deregulation that we've talked about. They always talk about the perpetual driver shortage and so therefore lobbied for lower driver requirements. The American Trucking Association has long maintained that there's a truck driver shortage, but other organizations are not so sure. For instance, for decades, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association has maintained that those claims about a driver shortage are false. And in recent years, multiple studies have confirmed that the Owner-Operator Association is right, that there is no driver shortage and any market tightness could be fixed by increasing wages. Now, that in and of itself is a problem because there's not necessarily a lot of free cash on hand to increase wages, and yet we do want safe roads. Now, the American Trucking Association has also come out and clarified that they're not just saying there's a shortage of drivers, period, but that they mean qualified drivers. And ATA President and CEO Chris Spear defined that as meaning, quote, qualified means you can speak English, read road signs, understand safety rules, and respect our laws. Qualified means you are not abusing alcohol or using drugs. Qualified means you earned your CDL the right way, not through a rubber-stamped process in a state that looks the other way. Unfortunately, it's that rubber-stamped process in a state that looks the other way that has led to so many deaths. Now, in addition to the question of English language proficiency, there's also been a lot of high-profile question about citizenship in the qualification process. You have to have an employment-based visa as a non-citizen to get a CDL, and that license generally expires when your work authorization expires. Lawful permanent residents with a green card can absolutely get a CDL. Now, in response to some of these accidents, the U.S. Department of Transportation recently announced an emergency interim final rule that aims to strengthen federal oversight of how states issue these non-domiciled commercial driver's licenses. And it's going to have an impact. One transportation law firm estimated that between 6 and 18% of the commercial driver workforce nationwide might be affected. Since the beginning of this calendar year, the FMCSA has identified at least 5 fatal crashes involving non-domiciled CDL holders, according to that emergency interim rule. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy has suggested that the Department of Transportation might withdraw states' rights to issue CDLs. They are currently the ones that issue and administer the CDLs, but it's supposed to be in accordance with federal rules. And an important addition, they're not just looking at the states and their administration or the training programs and how they're offering the licenses. They're also looking into the companies hiring drivers that don't have the appropriate qualifications. Now, California is getting most of the attention on this issue because of that state's role in 2 of the highest profile crashes that took place this year. They rank second nationally in highway fatalities caused by commercial trucks. But they recently passed legislation to try to eliminate these substandard commercial driving schools. So they are taking steps to fix the problem, but much of the damage has already been done. The Department of Transportation determined that over a quarter of California's CDLs issued to foreign-born drivers were awarded improperly. And they've taken steps to withhold funds, as much as $40 million from California, because they have determined that the state has failed to comply with certain English language proficiency standards. As Secretary Duffy said in a statement on October 15th, quote, "California is the only state in the nation that refuses to ensure big rig drivers can read our road signs and communicate with law enforcement." California is pushing back. They have formally defended their handling of non-domiciled commercial driver's licenses and say that it's substantially compliant with federal law. And the truth is, it's going to take more than this interim federal rule to drive a change. Because a couple of weeks ago, a federal appeals court paused those DOT limits on which foreign-born drivers can or can't get driver's licenses. They said the DOT didn't follow proper procedure in drafting the rule and failed to, quote, "articulate a satisfactory explanation for how the rule would promote safety." The court offered some interesting data. It said that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's own data shows that immigrants who hold CDLs account for roughly 5% of all commercial driver's licenses, but only 0.2% of all fatal crashes. They just happen to have been involved in the last 2 highly publicized fatal crashes. Now, under the new rule, if it were allowed to take effect, only 10,000 of the 200,000 non-citizens with commercial driver's licenses would qualify for them. But this rule can't be enforced retroactively. So the 190,000 drivers would be allowed to keep their CDLs, at least until they come up for renewal. Duffy has said that California and 5 other states have improperly issued CDLs. But California is the only state that the federal government has taken action against because they were the first one where an audit was completed. Can't imagine why they were selected. The reviews in the other states are still planned, but they were delayed by the government shutdown. Now, English language proficiency and legal residency or legal right to work in the United States are not the only issues where we're having administrative problems around CDLs. So is driver health. Interstate truck drivers are required to take a physical exam and have a medical examiner certificate every other year just to confirm that they're healthy enough to safely perform their job. On April 10th, the FMCSA voided over 15,000 current medical examiner certificates that were issued by two specific doctors between March of 2023 and March of 2025. That affects that same number, 15,000 commercial motor vehicle drivers. What they figured out is that these two doctors were issuing way too many certificates. And so the DOT worked with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to investigate. They found that those doctors were simply, again, rubber stamping. They did not correctly apply the required standards in determining that those drivers were physically qualified to operate one of these massive commercial motor vehicles. Now, whether there is a driver shortage or not, there is definitely a large and growing road safety problem. And we have to make sure that any rules, regulations, or administrative procedures that are in place achieve what we need, both in terms of business and freight and the economy, but also in terms of public safety. One of my favorite statements that I came across in researching this episode comes from Craig Fuller. He's the founder and CEO of FreightWaves. And in a video statement, he talked about the fact that it's a problem that, quote, anyone could get a CDL. He went on to talk about how problematic it is that CDLs are becoming pieces of paper that mean nothing. And he points out that it's just as important that Secretary Duffy is going after the hiring companies as it is that he's going after the CDLs, CDL mills, and the administration that has allowed this situation to exist. The reality is all of this confusion makes it harder for safe, compliant trucking companies to operate profitably. And that should ultimately be the goal. We don't want to respond or overreact to a few very high-profile accidents, but we also can't deny the fact that the change that took effect in 2022 is not keeping our roads safe. So we will have to see beyond the headlines, hopefully, what additional changes take place. Until then, if you're on the road in a rig or if you're on the road in a passenger vehicle, stay safe out there.